Imagine someone offers you an old wooden box. No locks, no hidden compartments, no treasure inside. Just a box you could find at the garage sale for a few dollars. But there is one condition. Every person holding it before you had the exact same warning. Do not open it. Some claim that after bringing it into their homes, they began having identical nightmares. Others spoke of sudden illness, unexplained fear, and the overwhelming feeling that they were not longer alone. People who did not believe in curses begged to get rid of it. Over the years, this simple wooden box earned a reputation as one of the most haunted objects in the modern world. The strange part is that no one can agree on what it really is. Mass hysteria or a warning that should have been taken seriously. Before we begin, ask yourself one question. Would you open it? Welcome to the Parallel Case. In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is the restless spirit of a dead person. It is believed to be the soul of someone who died with unresolved conflict or unfinished purpose. According to traditional stories, it does not move on after death and instead seeks attachment to the living. In some accounts, it can possess a person and influence their thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Victims are often described as experiencing fear, confusion, personality changes, and emotional distress. The word Dybbuk comes from a Hebrew root meaning to cling or attach. This idea reflects the belief that the spirit does not simply enter, but actively latches onto a host. In classical religious texts and folklore, the Dybbuk is almost always connected to human beings. It is part of older mystical traditions that deal with possession, purification, and exorcism rituals. There are recorded stories from Eastern European Jewish communities where rabbis were said to perform rituals to remove such spirits. However, even in these accounts, the focus remains on people rather than objects or places. The idea that a Dybbuk could inhabit a physical object like a box is not part of the original folklore. That concept is a modern interpretation that emerged much later in popular culture. As the legend evolved through internet stories and media, the definition of what a Dybbuk could attach itself to began to expand. And that shift raises an important question. If the original myth was always about human possession, how did the idea of a haunted object ever become part of the story? In February 2003, an American antiques dealer named Kevin Menis listed an old wooden box for auction on eBay. At first look, it appeared to be nothing more than a simple handcrafted item with no obvious value. According to Menis, he had purchased it during an estate sale from the belongings of an old woman. The house had belonged to a family that had survived the Holocaust. And according to their account, the box had a history that was never meant to be shared publicly. They claimed that something inside the box was referred to as a Dybbuk, and they strongly warned that it should never be opened. Despite these warnings, the box was eventually taken from the estate and brought into Menis' possession. What happened next would become the foundation of everything that followed. And the question that remains is, why this particular object was ever put up for sale at all? Almost immediately after acquiring the box, Kevin Menis began reporting unexplained events that he could never easily dismiss. What started as small discomforts quickly turned into a pattern of experiences that felt increasingly abnormal and difficult to explain. Strong and unusual odors would appear without any clear source, including the sense of jasmine mixed with something sharp and unpleasant, similar to cat urine. These smells would come and go unpredictably, often filling rooms for no apparent reason, and then disappearing just as suddenly. At the same time, he began experiencing recurring nightmares that felt unusually vivid and consistent in their structure. The dreams were not random, but seemed seemed to repeat similar themes and sensations each night, creating a growing sense of psychological pressure. Upon waking, he described a lingering feeling that something foreign was present in the room with him, even when there is no physical evidence of it. This sensation gradually became more persistent and began affecting his ability to feel safe in his own home. Over time, the boundary between sleep and wakefulness began to feel less distinct, as if the experience was continuing after he opened his eyes. One of the most unsettling moments in the early period involved a visit from his mother. She came to see him shortly after the box was brought into the home, and according to his account, she interacted with the object directly. Not long after that visit, she suffered a sudden and severe medical episode that required immediate hospitalization. This incident became a turning point in how Kevin explained everything that had been happening. What once could have been dismissed as coincidence or stress now felt connected in a way that was harder to ignore. The experiences did not stop and instead became more emotionally intense, and the question that began to form in his mind was no longer whether something unusual was happening, but whether it was somehow centered around the box itself. When the box was finally opened, the contents appeared unusual and difficult to explain. Inside were 2 old pennies, a lock of light-colored hair, a lock of dark-colored hair, a small candle holder, a tiny wine goblet, a dry rose, and a small granite figurine. At first glance, none of these items seemed valuable or connected. There was no obvious pattern or explanation for why they had been placed together. Each object looked ordinary on its own. Some details suggested personal meaning, while others felt completely random. As the list of items became known, people began to speculate about their origin and purpose. Some tried to explain them as symbolic objects tied to a ritual or folklore. Others believed they were simply sentimental keepsakes with no deeper meaning. But despite all theories, one fact remained unchanged. No one could clearly explain why these specific objects were sealed inside the box. After the sale, the story did not end. It only changed hands. Each new owner of the box reported a similar pattern of experiences that were difficult to ignore. Recurring nightmares that felt identical in tone and detail, sudden illnesses that appeared without clear explanation, a constant feeling of being watched, even in empty rooms, an increasing sense of fear that seemed to grow the longer the object remained in their possession. At first, these accounts were treated with skepticism. Coincidence was the most common explanation, followed by stress, imagination, or suggestion. But as more people came forward, the similarities between their stories became harder to dismiss. The details did not change much from one account to another, only the names of the people involved were different. Some owners claimed they tried to get rid of the box as quickly as possible, even accepting financial loss just to remove it from their lives. With each transfer of ownership, the reputation of the box grew stronger. What had started as a single strange item became a story that followed by object itself. And the more it was discussed, the more it seemed to gain its own identity, until the question was no longer who owned the box, but why no one seemed able to keep it for a very long. In the 2010s, the Dybbuk Box caught the attention of paranormal investigator Zach Bagans. As the story continued to grow, the Dybbuk Box became more than just an object in a museum. It became a central piece of modern paranormal culture. It was discussed in documentaries, online forums, and television programs around the world. At one point, the story even crossed into mainstream entertainment, when Zach Bagans worked with Post Malone on a paranormal-themed project where the box and other artifacts from the museum were explored in front of the cameras. Post Malone was genuinely curious about the paranormal and initially approached the experience with an open mind.
Because I'm friends with Zach Bagans from Ghost Adventures, right? So apparently there's a thing called the Dybbuk Box, which is one of the most haunted items in the world, apparently.
However, during his collaboration with Zak Bagans, the environment around the project became increasingly intense and heavily influenced by Zak. There were also public events where participants described intense psychological reactions while being exposed to so-called cursed objects, including readings and performances tied to themes of shadow figures and dark presence. One of the most frequently mentioned elements in these events was a performance involving a poem about the Shadow Man, where Kevin Menes read the text aloud in a highly emotional setting, which added to the already intense atmosphere surrounding the museum.
Light from the hallway crept into my room, along with the Shadow Man too, I assume. Never before had I seen such a form that could change as a candle's flame licks in a storm.
What in the hell?
It was no longer just a cursed object. But I did a small bit of research, and it turns out the poem actually belongs to the same person who performed it during the session, which makes the situation even more ironic, because in the way he ended up becoming both the creator and the evidence of his own experience. In other words, Kevin did not just read the story, he effectively wrote himself into it and then got caught inside the very performance he created. In 2012, the horror film The Possession was released. While the movie did not directly retell the real events in detail, it was clearly inspired by the story of the Dybbuk Box. The film introduced the concept to a global audience and turned a relatively unknown internet legend into a mainstream topic of discussion. From that moment, the story stopped being limited to online forums and paranormal discussions. It became part of the global pop culture. And the idea of a cursed object hidden inside of ordinary box reached millions of people around the world. But there is one major problem with the entire story. Many researchers believe the Dybbuk Box narrative was heavily exaggerated or even entirely fabricated. Over time, Kevin Menes himself admitted that certain elements of the story were embellished and shaped for dramatic effect. This opened the door to a different interpretation of everything that had been reported. Some skeptics argued that the idea of the cursed object was created first and the experiences followed afterward. In other words, the story may have influenced how people explain normal events. Sleep paralysis, nightmares, stress, and coincidence can all feel much more meaningful when they are framed through fear. Once a person believes an object is cursed, every small negative event begins to feel connected to it. A bad night becomes a sign, a strange smell becomes evidence, a coincidence becomes a pattern. From this perspective, the Dybbuk Box is not an object with power, but a story with power, a psychological feedback loop where expectation shapes perception and perception reinforces belief. And the more the story is spread online, the stronger that loop may have become. But when we step away from the story itself and look at it from the outside, a different picture begins to appear. The Dybbuk Box narrative is powerful not because of what it proves, but because of how easily it spreads through human perception. Stories like this do not need strong evidence to survive. They only need repetition, emotion, and uncertainty. Once an idea enters a person's mind in a suggestive context, the brain naturally starts searching for patterns. It connects unrelated events. It gives meaning to coincidence. It turns neutral experience into emotionally charged signals. A bad night becomes part of the pattern. A strange smell becomes confirmation. A moment of fear becomes proof. This is not supernatural influence. It is how perception works under expectation. And when fear becomes part of the interpretation, even ordinary events can feel significant. The most important factor in stories like this is not the object itself, but the narrative built around it. Once a label like cursed is attached, it changes how every future experience is remembered and described. This is why accounts often sound so familiar, even when they come from different people. Not because the experiences are identical, but because the framework of describing them already exists. Over time, online communities, media coverage, and retellings reinforce that framework. Each new version adds detail, emotion and expectation, and slowly the story becomes more coherent than the original facts ever were. The Dybbuk Box in this light is less a mystery of an object, and more a demonstration of how easily the human mind can be guided by suggestion. After everything we've heard, after every story, every account, and every contradiction, we are left with the same silence that started it all. A simple object that continues to divide opinion to this day. For some, it is nothing more than a story that grew through repetition and belief. For others, it remains something that carries a presence that cannot be easily explained. The truth, however, is much less mysterious. There has never been evidence that any of the paranormal events surrounding the box were real. Most of what made this story famous comes from online retellings, dramatized accounts, and creative additions that changed over time. What began as a simple auction listing slowly turned into an internet legend, not because of facts, but because of storytelling. Each retelling added tension, emotion, and meaning that were never part of the original events. And over time, the line between what actually happened and what was imagined became completely blurred. Once a story reaches that point, it no longer needs truth to survive. The Dybbuk Box is not a confirmed cursed object. It is an internet-era myth, shaped by interpretation, media attention, and the human tendency to find patterns in uncertainty. Now the box remains closed, not because of anything inside it, but because the detail has always been less important than the story built around it. And there is the real answer. There is no hidden force, no confirmed curse, no unexplained phenomenon behind it, only a narrative that grew until it felt real. If you enjoy stories where reality and fiction blur, remember that sometimes the most convincing mysteries are the ones we unknowingly create ourselves. See you in the next case.